Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of All You Need to Know with your host, Saranya Gopinath. Hope you're all doing wonderfully well this June evening. In previous episodes, we have looked at important AI concepts such as sovereign AI, as well as even more recently, the global supply chain and the impact of it on crucial AI infrastructure like chips and other resources. But today we're discussing a whole new aspect of the AI conversation AI and its capacity to be a global power broker, one way or the other. Now, if you've been paying attention to the AI world, you know why this conversation is so topical. Less than 24 hours before the time of this recording, on 12th June, Anthropic made an announcement that it was globally rolling back access of its Mythos and Fable models. Now, we have covered the Mythos model in an earlier episode, that as well as Project Glasswing, where we discussed how Anthropic's latest, most impactful model was very critically evaluated and was being released in very controlled environments to a select number of users to evaluate its broader impact. And it was also part of conversations with the US government and so on and so forth. Fable was Anthropic's newest commercially released model. It had Mythos like capabilities, but with safety features towards making it more generally publicly available. It was released earlier this month. This was required specifically for that reason, that because of Mythos's capacity for impact and disruption, Fable was released with checks in place. While there were clearly a lot of conversations and a lot of thinking that went behind this, yesterday this all came to an end. But let's take a step back and look at this story from the beginning. Project Glasswing, with the limited release of Mythos, was released on April 7th. It was a public announcement. They made it available to the US government and to pre-identified set of users to evaluate its impact. That cohort of users who were accessing it grew a little bit over the past couple of weeks, where they were making it available to entities outside the US as well. Fable, the commercial version of Mythos, was released on June 9th, which is not so long ago. And then yesterday, on 12th June, at 5:21 p.m. Eastern Time, Anthropic received a very clear and oddly specific directive from the US government citing national security concern. And I want to read this out. It was to suspend access to Fable 5 and Mythos 5 to any foreign national, whether inside or outside the United States, including foreign national Anthropic employees. Pursuant to this directive, Anthropic went ahead and suspended access to all customers towards ensuring compliance. The national security risk that was cited was with the demonstration of one potential jailbreak. Anthropic has since reviewed the claim and found that the cited capability already exists in GPT-5 and is used by cybersecurity defenders across the platforms. Effectively, the identified jailbreak risk was not Fable specific, but was more of a market-wide baseline. What do we mean by a jailbreak risk? The concern was that the impact of this action of the jailbreak could result in access to Fable without the checks and balances that Anthropic had built in, effectively like making Mythos more openly available to all users. Anthropic found out and demonstrated that this is not the scaled risk that the government was implying. They're saying that it's a very narrow risk that was identified. And in its compliance, while immediately the note was sent out and Anthropic has taken all steps to comply with the directive, it has publicly said that they disagree with the directive made. They said, and I quote, "If this standard was applied across the industry, it would essentially halt all new model deployments for all frontier providers." I want you to hear that again. Halt all new model deployments for all frontier providers. And that's a really big deal. But let's go back and think about the specific manner of the directive itself. And that's what really caught my fancy. When they talked about the accessibility of it to foreign nationals inside or outside the US, including Anthropic employees. So effectively what this means is, let's say there is an Anthropic employee who's been working on Fable for 3 years or so as part of the research team. As of yesterday, they can no longer access it. But at the same time, another colleague of theirs, who, let's say, became a naturalized citizen on Tuesday, would still have access to it. That is actually the literal interpretation of the directive that Anthropic has quoted. And this is where things have to be more than what they seem. At first glance, it looks like an AI safety security story. And I get that. Anthropic, in its own discussion at the point of releasing Mythos, talked about how the government should have the ability to shut down and control access if the situation should arise. But given the nature of the way in which the directive has come about, and the way that Anthropic has pushed back on it, I actually have a couple of more questions. But I want to spend some more time understanding the entire story before we start calling strikes and scores. Let me play devil's advocate. Why would the government believe that this is necessary? Objectively speaking, the frontier models are different from previous generations of software. They are more akin to strategic assets than just a software release. Like, this is not Microsoft Word we're talking about, with all due credit to Microsoft Word. This is more as critical infrastructure on which the world expects industries and entire verticals to be built upon. So this has to be evaluated with a closer lens. Second point, the proliferation risk is quite real. If there is really a concern of a jailbreak or a security vulnerability in Fable, this is not something which should be taken lightly. Anthropic also admitted that as tech advances, the Fable or any of their frontier models being vulnerable to attacks is realistic. That's very nature of the beasts that we are dealing with, that it is going to get more powerful and more intelligent in its capability to attack existing models. But having said that, I think the pushback is more that these calls of shutting down access or limiting perspective should be made based on deeply held research and understanding or mutual understanding of the parties. And I think that's possibly where that could be seen as a little bit of not being on the same page. And then lastly, with all of this of potential and solving, we need to understand that as a government state, they historically err on the side of caution in the case of uncertainties, whether it's excessive or not. And we've seen this. This is not the first time in history where a government or a nation tries to control very sensitive or very powerful material, whether it's the Wassenaar Agreement or even export code controls on encryption in the 1990s. They understand the size and impact of what they've created and built and make sure that there are checks and balances to it. And the first thing they do is control who is able to access it. It's not something which, it may not be fun to hear, but it's logical thinking of where a government is coming from. The first thing they want to do is make sure we know who is getting access to this, and then we can take appropriate action. There are aspects of jurisdiction and friendly nations that come into play when a government is taking these decisions. In spite of having opened this door to the government earlier, is that they disagree with the specific stance taken. As at the time of this recording, it's also come to light that it's possibly a bunch of researchers from Amazon who introduced this jailbreak to the government and wrote a letter for them talking about the potential. Now, I don't really know why that calling out of company has become important on the public square. Let's assume that it is well-intentioned until proven otherwise. But the implication, I think, is that this is more of a competitor game and not really on the merits of the model itself. But at this point, we are just making assumptions. Okay. Let's look at what this implies. As I mentioned, this is not the first time that this is happening, whether it's happened on tools before or in larger systems. Let me give you an old world analogy, which is very prevalent and really helps explain the impact of these decisions. So SWIFT. SWIFT is, of course, the money transfer process, the money transfer system, a Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. It's what all of us have used at some point or the other in transferring money across countries. It's a messaging network and runs as the core plumbing of the global financial systems. For years, it was considered as neutral infrastructure, right? It just exists to move money. However, the US and the EU have since used it as a weapon for political ends and for diplomacy as well. Iran was disconnected from SWIFT in 2015 and again in 2018. Russia, during the Ukraine war, lost access for major banks in 2022. So we can see how what was earlier seen as very neutral infrastructure was then used as part of bargaining chips to express displeasure on a country's actions and behavior. But what's interesting is what happened next. Europe in its effort to maintain trade with Iran without breaching US sanctions, that is, on non-USD based trade, built INSTEX. It's a parallel clearing system designed to operate entirely outside of SWIFT. This was built in and released in 2019. Was it good? Absolutely not. It was clunky, it's slow, and is possibly working at a fraction of the volume that Swift does and is nowhere close to global standard as of date. The point is that it exists. When Swift was used and was shut down as a part of political conversations or conversations between nations, an alternative came into light. As imperfect as it was, the point was that it was an option. Now look at what the Fable shutdown just did. It told every country, every enterprise is building on AI infrastructure from the US that this pipe can be turned off. Not because your usage was dangerous, or the way you were employing it was dangerous, but because of where your employees were born. There is a world where we have to start understanding what did they mean by foreign nationals. If there was an American living in Delhi, would he have access? But of course, that is an impossible needle to thread for Anthropic to start figuring out how to give access, because there is no RBAC in the world which processes nationality. And so they had to shut down access for everybody. We also covered a similar analogy in the semiconductor world. Quick recap. About 5 years ago, Chinese AI actually ran on NVIDIA, but similarly, US export controls took the decision to limit the access of NVIDIA chips to China. Now, what ended up happening is that Chinese firms took the call that self-sufficiency was no longer optional. Huawei is one of the greatest winners of this conversation. Their executives literally thanked the US government for accelerating chip development. These controls have created a competitive universe in the Chinese AI world. Now, obviously, one would argue that chips and models are completely different. One is physical, with chip design that once it's shared, is shared forever, and software can theoretically be patched and controlled. But irrespective, you can see that the way that Chinese AI conversation is developing, but even including the models, is thriving, irrespective of all of these controls that have been placed upon it. This rollback makes one communication very clear, that American technology infrastructure is conditional, revocable, and subject to overnight policy changes. And that's a big deal because of this reason. The decision to make Fable and Mythos available to the rest of the world could potentially be rolled back, right? Like tomorrow, and Anthropic is fighting this right now. Anthropic could make the case, the US government could listen, and they'll be like, hey, you know what? We're rolling it back, no issue. Fable and Mythos now will be available to everybody. But the problem is that the trust deficit has already found its place. At the time of reading this story, you must have come across hundreds, if not thousands, of tweets, LinkedIn posts, social media outrage of everybody across the world talking about this is a wake-up call for needing your own sovereign AI. Let me tell you what's happening in the conversations I'm part of. India is actually one of the largest non-US markets for most of these platforms, whether it's ChatGPT or Anthropic. And now you've just gone and told them that we don't know what your continued access of it is, and your dependence of the access to these models for building whatever it is you're building, whether it's governments, banks, large enterprises, your dependence on this is subject to one overnight policy change from the US government. Now, in all of this, we're actually missing out one major story, which is how exactly are the enterprises taking it? The nations are effectively using Anthropic and ChatGPT possibly as bargaining chips. Think about it. Is it outside the realm of logic that once access has been restricted, access is reopened, first starting to US-friendly nations, to identified partners of the country, and so on? How does that impact the commercial decisions that Anthropic or OpenAI will have to start making? This has a direct impact on their P&L, how their customers view them, and their ability to freely conduct business. When the government gets to tell you who you can or cannot make your products available to, that is something of substantial impact that each of these companies need to look at. That's a trust deficit which has taken central place in each of their evaluation. I can tell you, tomorrow, sovereign risk for any AI infrastructure is going to just be identified as really high. And this is not just a nation state conversation. This is what's happening in boardrooms across the world who are customers of each of these large platforms. And this is where some of our earlier conversations start resonating with the call for sovereign AI as a result of all of this trust deficit. One of two things is going to happen. One is, of course, the call for sovereign AI. And in India, we've already done that, whether it's with Sarvam and India AI sponsored or funded programs. Even in Europe, you have Mistral AI from France and many such instances across the world. One is creating your own models. But the second part, and this is where some of our earlier conversations really resonate, is the local deployment of these models. If you remember, a couple of months ago, we had discussed about how OpenAI was launching an instance of their frontier model deployed on UAE-controlled infrastructure for the entire country of the United Arab Emirates. Or effectively, it was locally hosted, it was created as sovereign infrastructure, this is beyond the reach of Washington, and it allowed for a countrywide access and control of an instance of ChatGPT. You can already see versions of this, like in Saudi Arabia, there's Project Transcendence, which is towards creating sovereign AI infrastructure, apart from the model story that we already mentioned. When you start making these countrywide implementations, if you recall how our sovereign AI story went, what is most likely going to happen is that we are going to splinter the world into parallel AI ecosystems. And we saw this directly as a result of DeepSeek. What's most likely going to happen is that you're going to have instances of these models for different nations. You have a chat GPT for UAE, you have a chat GPT for France, you have an Anthropic for India, and so on and so forth. So what happens is that a student in Paris may ask an AI system a question about climate policy. An engineer in Mumbai asks the same question. But in a fragmented AI world, each of them get different answers because they are trained on different data, and each of them are running on closed loop systems which aren't really learning from each other. They are creating silos and echo chambers because there is no way to create a continuum without the risk of losing it all. That's insane. That's not just a technical problem. It's going to be an epistemological problem where it is actually going to be the logical endpoint of the trajectory we're on. And that's what happens when the trust deficit takes as deep root as we're currently talking about. The early internet also faced this point of forking. It could have fragmented into multiple national intranets, but there was this concerted action to not take that step, which led to the internet as it is today. Or else we'll all be just talking to each other within our country, within our society, within our very localized community, without the internet, with only an intranet. And that's why the degree of what we are doing really matters. With the internet, it was only about selective filtering. But when we're now talking about instances of AI platforms, we are creating parallel infrastructure with different architectures, different training data, different governance assumptions, different personal data laws, and so on and so forth. And that's no longer a firewall conversation. That is silos erupting across the world. But I want to take a step back. At no point am I saying that this is an argument against AI governance. If you've been watching this podcast for more than one episode, you know that I believe and understand that AI governance is the need of the hour. The concern, however, is the manner in which governance is deployed. And there may have been rational reason for this. But currently, we are seeing export controls being used as a substitute for actual governance by creating opaque, nationality-based, non-appealable, overnight implication without a statutory process actually has the opposite of the intended outcome, strategically and commercially, and creates concern for the population it claims to protect. The manner in which these export controls were used as a tool possibly have justification, that given the nature of the risk, there was a need to act fast and swiftly, and this was the most effective way to do so. But without it leading to a more deeper analysis that can be discussed by parties across the world, this is not going to have any positive impact on where the conversation lies currently. Going back to what for me is the thread running through this entire thing, the deep trust deficit. Now, with all of this, where does this leave this conversation, right? I think I would summarize it into a couple of things. One is that by taking the decision the way they have, there is a concern as to the manner in which access can be continued. There is a concern as to which how infrastructure can be relied upon. And as much as this is a developmental concern for, let's say, anybody outside the US who was building products or models based on US tools, this is a commercial risk for the US companies as well. And this stands to challenge the way that frontier models are thought of and how our AI trajectory is plotted from this point on. Like I said, access can be reversed, but trust will take a little more time. And unfortunately, we all have to react to this trust deficit created by evaluating localized models, by evaluating stronger checks and balances to how to ensure that access is continued in some version, whether it is like software escrows, whether it is local deployments, or whether it's a trade for when local data is accessed. And the second thing is that we need to do everything in our power to make sure that, like, 10 years down the line, we're not living in parallel realities because information and data is not flowing between our multiple systems and multiple countries of the world. Because in the globalized world we live today, it's impossible to make these decisions in silos. So, for example, if Africa does not have medical data research from the US, or if Europe does not have data about immigrants from East Asia moving to Europe, these are all things which are going to have international consequences. And it would be foolish of us to cut off our nose to spite our face in what is a progressively AI world. And I think, of course, the last bit is how can we make these decisions together as a planet as opposed to as one nation versus the other? Once we start plotting the conversation that way, I don't think it's going to lead to anything logical. And we have to figure out how that happens, how the whole planet is seen as stakeholders to this conversation, as opposed to a very archaic, it's mine, I own it kind of conversation. It's not in line with reality and how we're all expecting this AI conversation to play out. This episode was a little different. It wasn't the kind of conceptual deep dive, but it was mostly just analyzing the moment we are in and how that could affect where we are. I wish I had more constructive solutions at the end of this. I wish I had thoughts which were like, okay, we can solve this, but I really don't. Not today. But I would love to hear from you what you think about all of this. I know social media is going crazy as I record this, and that's going to go on for a bit. Hopefully, in about a week or 10 days, we have a little more information. We have a little more detailing as to why this has happened and how we can prevent it in the future. But until then, there's going to be a lot of umbrage. There's going to be a lot of rage. People talking about we should, forget Anthropic. We should be building our own thing. Forget ChatGPT. We should be building our own thing. But that's not realistic. It's no more realistic than saying we should not be using Google. We have to figure out a way to make this work for everybody, because that's actually most beneficial to all parties involved. So I don't know. This was a little bit of a think out loud. It'd be great to hear from you what you have to say about this. But until then, that's all from me on All You Need to Know, and look forward to catching you on the next episode. See you.